Nestled in the rolling hills of Lower Merion Township in southeastern Pennsylvania lies a piece of American history not forgotten. Americans search for their history in the homes of their patriots. The Harriton House is no exception. Charles Thompson, the first and only secretary to the Continental and Confederation Congresses, was Harriton's most famous occupant. But the story of the house and the estate encompasses more than 300 years of American history. The Harriton property was originally a 698-acre land grant from William Penn to the Welsh Quaker Rowan Ellis in 1682 within the Welsh township of Merion or Merion, and part of a much larger tract of land known as the Welsh Barony or Welsh Tract. The Welsh Quakers who settled this area wanted a self-governing, Welsh-speaking township within William Penn's new colony. Although the Welsh community assimilated quickly into the cosmopolitan community in and around Philadelphia, traces of our Welsh heritage survive in places names such as Bryn Mawr, Ballackinwood, and Merion. We find other survivals in buildings built by these settlers, such as the Harriton House, the Merion Meeting House on Montgomery Avenue in Narberth, and the 1690 house on Mill Creek Road. Rowan Ellis described his new property as land with much wildlife, good trees and water, and few Indians. The Indians were mostly gone from this area by 1700. The house we know as Harriton was built by Ellis in 1704 and called Bryn Mawr, which means high hill in Welsh. The name of the town, Bryn Mawr, comes from this house. The town was originally known as Humphreysville. The name of the house and the estate changed in 1719 to Harriton with Ellis's sale of the property to Maryland tobacco planter Richard Harrison. Though a Quaker, Harrison brought tobacco and African slaves to Harriton with him. Tobacco was grown successfully here for 30 years with slaves, and this property was the northernmost tobacco plantation in the colonies. From 1789 to 1824, Harriton was the home of Richard Harrison's son-in-law, Charles Thompson, who retired here with his wife Hannah. After Thompson's death through the 1800s and into this century, Rowan Ellis's grand house was home to tenant farmers, and the estate was a farm. It was last used in the 1920s as the Harriton Guernsey Dairy, which provided fresh milk and cream daily to the growing population of the Lower Merion Township. It was this same growth in Lower Merion which ended the agricultural use of the Harriton estate. Comfortable homes, roads, and the Harriton High School now occupy former fields and pastures. Rowan Ellis's 698-acre estate surrounding his house has been vastly reduced in size. Today, the restored 1704 Harriton House and the 16.5-acre park are open to the public as a cultural resource owned by the Township of Lower Merion and administered by the Harriton Association.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Bruce Gill. I'm the curator of the house and the director of the Harriton Association.
It's nice to meet you, Mr. Gill. We were just enjoying the garden and the view of the meadow.
It really is a wonderful outlook and a precious piece of open space in our community. Of course, the park is just a little chip of the original 698-acre estate, and it never really looked like this in the 1700s or the 1800s.
No?
No, most of the tall trees that you see in the park below us were planted about 70 years ago. This was all farmland under cultivation up until the 1920s. The farm of the original owner, Roland Ellis, was a small subsistence operation, probably not much larger than the park you see today. The second owner, Richard Harrison, cultivated tobacco with slaves on more of the land, and his son-in-law, Charles Thompson, let the farm out on shares, as he said, or he tenant farmed the land because he didn't believe in slavery. He grew grains and Indian corn, flax for linen, and he raised honeybees. Timber was also cut and sold from the property to builders and tradesmen, such as the carriage makers in Philadelphia. The big garden was just over there, near the well and along the path to the privy. The garden was laid out in 24 squares, bordered by strawberries and pepper grass. That bump or hill is a root cellar for the storing of garden produce such as potatoes and cabbage for winter use. It was built about 1799, and foodstuffs were stored in boxes or barrels or on racks in the cool, damp room. The garden, the privy, the well, and the root cellar are about the only buildings we have left today to remind us that this was agricultural property.
I never would have guessed. Could you tell us something about the house?
Certainly. The three-story stone house that Roland Ellis built is a unique survival of early American domestic architecture in Pennsylvania. It's a substantial and pretentious house built for a substantial member of the Welsh community who represented the Welsh Township of Merion in the Pennsylvania Assembly and as an overseer of the Quaker schools in Philadelphia. You'll notice that the browns and grays of the stonework in the masonry wall is set off by this bright white pointing. And you see the arch, little segmental arch over the window on the second floor, and that uniform color, texture, and size of that soft gray stone that forms the arch. Again, is set off by that bright white pointing and has the little bit of plastered decoration just underneath the arch. The stonework is very medieval in its verticality, and the gables are topped by tall brick chimneys with heavy caps. And as your eye comes down the roof line, you see the flaring eaves, which tends to throw snow and rainwater away from the building. And then the little pent eave on the front of the building is a holdover from an early architectural form and was usually found on buildings built prior to 1730. As we look at the house, remember that it is Roland Ellis's 1704 building, restored to the period when Charles and Hannah Thompson lived here at the end of the century. They moved into an 85-year-old farmhouse and are really the focus of the restoration today. The floor plan of Roland Ellis's house is a T-shape with 2 rooms in front, a stair hall, and 1 room behind on each of 3 floors. The 1704 kitchen was the tail on the T-shape. After 1789, this brick room, added by Charles Thompson, was used as the kitchen. The food would have been carried out of the kitchen, under the piazza, and back into the house. Let's go inside. This is the original 1704 closed-string staircase with its very heavy turned balusters, moldings, and handrail. All of this is typical of 17th century work. And these are the great girders or summer beams which support the second floor, which were also typical of 17th century work. The carved profiles and the angled chamfer cut is purely decorative. The 2 front rooms in Roland Ellis's T-shaped house were known as the Great Hall or Common Parlor and the Parlor, which was the formal front room of the house. This is the Great Hall or Common Parlor, which was the principal activity area in the building when the house was first built. Charles Thompson used this room as his study or library, and he used the closets as bookcases and filing cabinets. There was a visitor about 1810 who described the closets, saying the doors always stood open and the books and papers came tumbling out. These are the portraits of Charles and Hannah Thompson. They're copies of the originals, which are in Washington, D.C. Charles Thompson was a Scots-Irishman from Northern Ireland who emigrated to America as a small boy. He was a teacher and headmaster of the Latin school in the Philadelphia Quaker schools during the 1750s. Later, he was a successful businessman and was a distiller of rum. But he's best known as the first and only secretary to the Continental and Confederation Congresses. As the administrator of the Congresses, he was the only man who saw the entire process from the first Congress to his last official act of telling George Washington at Mount Vernon that Washington had been elected the first president of the United States under the new Constitution. Thompson was not offered a position in the new government, so in July of 1789 he retired here to Harriton to be a farmer and to return to his classical studies. And it was in this room that he made the first translation of the Bible from Greek to English that was published on the North American continent.
Are these the furnishings that Ellis would have had or that Thompson would have had?
You have to remember that this is Roland Ellis's structure, but the house has been restored to the period when the Thompsons lived here after 1789. This chair is the oldest in the house and typical of the furniture that Ellis might have had, but Charles and Hannah Thompson would have been more familiar with what you see today. Roland Ellis had been dead for 30 or 40 years before any of this furniture was designed, let alone made. Most of the furniture that you see around the house did not actually belong to the Thompsons, but was the kinds of things that they would have had in the house. There are a few things that have come back to the building, and we're always on the lookout for Thompson furniture and Thompson objects. This little desk and this chair did belong to Charles Thompson. The desk is interesting because he had it made for himself when he became the Secretary of the Congress. In fact, he probably went to the cabinet maker and said, "I need something in a hurry and I need it on the cheap," because the drawer fronts are made out of old table leaves. Stylistically, the desk isn't much of a piece of furniture. It's interesting, but historically it's important because all of the important papers of Congress went through this desk and were stored here, including the Declaration of Independence. The little handles, brass handles on the side, were used to transport the desk as Congress went from place to place. The Chippendale Chair is one of a set, and this chair was given to Charles Thompson's doctor after his death and descended in that family, and it's been placed on loan here. We have Charles Thompson's gold watch, which was given to us by a descendant. It's kind of an interesting watch because it's called a gold watch in a pair case, which means that it actually has two cases. It is silver with fire gilt decoration on top. And this little mug, or can, as it was called, and this silver porringer also belonged to Charles Thompson. They had belonged to his first wife, Ruth Mather, and they also came back from a descendant. In addition to his biblical translations, Thompson was interested in America's principal industry after the Revolution, which was agriculture. Earlier, Thompson had written a book called Notes on Agriculture, which he gave to his friends and family and described the newest agricultural methods and the rotation of crops in fields and the use of manures, things that we take for granted today. These are bee skeps, or bee houses, like the ones that Thompson used. Bees were very important livestock, and Thompson called them useful little animals. Of course, they produced honey, they produced wax for candles, and of course, with all of the food that was being grown on the farm, the family had to eat as well. The room behind me was Roland Ellis's kitchen, the back room on his T-shaped house. The big hearth was used for the preparation of meals and for cooking, and the room was very near the well and the garden that you saw outside. But you have to remember that Charles and Hannah Thompson moved into an 85-year-old farmhouse, and the use of architectural space changed in the intervening years between the time the house was built in 1704 and when they retired here in 1789. Dining rooms as a separate room in a house were not common when the house was built, but the Thompsons were city people living here at the end of the century, and they wanted a separate dining room. They took this room as their dining room and added a new kitchen to the rear of the house. The black on the ceiling that you see is smoke and grease from 18th century cooking fires, but the Thompsons probably had a plastered ceiling in this room. The big timbers, or girders, are cut from white oak trees when the house was built, and these trees were probably 300 to 350 years old when the house was built, which means that they were growing trees long before Columbus came to the New World. Knowing that they would move here in his retirement, the Thompsons added this big brick kitchen in 1787. And you can see where their brick addition just butts up against Roland Ellis's 1704 stonework. This room was a very utilitarian space, and it was used for the preparation of food. It was necessary to preparation of meals for the family. All of the things that you see, all of the stuff in the room was necessary to everyday life, such as this riddle, what we might call a flour sifter, or the cheese mold, which is nothing more than a bottomless barrel in which you put wet curds, put a weight on top, the weight pressed out the liquid through the bottom, and you end up with great rounds of cheese. And the big hearth was used for the actual cooking of the food. It was a lot like camping out. You would not have had one big fire. You would have had several little fires. And that's the reason that you find feet on kettles and pots and on little broilers such as this. They were sort of like burners on a stove.
What's that wooden door over there?
The wooden door is the oven, and this would have been used for the baking of breads and cookies and pies and so forth.
Wouldn't the wood on the door have been charred or burned?
No, not really, because the oven is like a little cave in which you build a big fire. And the fire made the masonry walls very hot. When the fire died down, you put your goods in to bake and closed the door to continue the baking process. Meats weren't cooked in ovens the way we cook today.
So how did they cook the meats?
Meats were cooked in front of the fire or over the fire. And we have over here a rotisserie kitchen in which you would put a roast or a piece of fowl and crank the handle in front of the fire. In addition to cranking the rotisserie by hand, you can be very high-tech in an 18th century manner, and there are clock jacks which are wound up with a key, and a piece of meat is suspended, and then they rotate back and forth in front of the fire, which means you could go away and do other things as well.
How do you know so much about the Thompsons' lifestyle here?
Research into many different areas gives us clues to the way people lived in the past. Examples are letters written by the Thompsons, inventories of estates made for probate purposes. We're particularly fortunate to have access to the diary of the Harriton farm kept by Charles Thompson from 1789 until 1817 when he had his first stroke. We know that the Thompsons didn't believe in slavery and that all of their household help was paid. And from his diary we have learned something about his kitchen help. There are wonderful references to the difficulty with household help. For example, one cook, Hannah, couldn't cook and had to be dismissed. Another, Sally, ran away and married Barnaby, the gardener. Another, Mary, drank all the beer in the basement and had to be dismissed. And still another was given money to buy seeds for the garden in town, but she never came back. A passing farmer the next day said that he saw her in a tavern downtown having a grand time. We also know that this was a growing community by the time the Thompsons lived here in the 1790s. Although we're standing in a kitchen with a bake oven, Charles Thompson describes saddling his horse, either Steady or Samson, and riding to the bakery in the nearby town. This was a very different landscape when they lived here in the 1790s than when Roland Ellis first arrived in the 1680s. Why don't we go up to the second floor? There were 3 rooms on the second floor and 3 rooms on the third. We only have 2 rooms on the second floor furnished as bedchambers, as they were called, and the third is used as our office. The rooms on the third floor are not open to the public and are used mostly for storage. We try to let the house tell us what it looked like in various periods of its history. For instance, we know that the house had casement windows when Roland Ellis first built it. We found this piece of a casement window frame reused as a brace in the attic. Painted surfaces were studied microscopically to determine what colors were used in what periods in the house. This blue color is one of the first colors that was used when the house was first painted by the Harrisons in the 1720s or 30s. And you remember the blue background in the wallpaper in the parlor downstairs. That paper is a copy of the paper put up by Charles and Hannah Thompson when they moved here in 1789.
This is a beautiful box. What was it used for?
This is fun, sort of like a portable computer of the 18th or early 19th centuries. It's a traveling desk with secret drawers. If you went to town on business, you'd probably have to spend the night and you would take your business papers with you. This little traveling desk has a place for pens. There are inkwells. Inside there's a document box for all of your important papers. And since you were spending the night, you might have to stay in a tavern with strangers. So you would have little secret drawers in which to hide all of your money and gold. Many of the objects in this room dealt with staying warm. The bed would have been surrounded by drapes which could have been pulled closed at night, much like sleeping in a tent. Big quilts and heavy blankets would have helped keep you warm too. Shared beds were neither ill thought of nor uncommon in households, particularly among young children, much like puppies huddling together to stay warm. Before you got into bed, you would take the bed warmer and fill it with hot coals, and it would have been rubbed between the cold sheets and blankets to warm up the bed so that you'd climb into something nice and warm. The last thing you would do before you got into bed was take one of these stones out of the fireplace, been heated up, and you would carry it to bed much the way we would take a hot water bottle or an electric heating pad. Before getting into bed at night, if you were sitting in a chair or if you were riding in a carriage or going to church, you could fill this foot stove with hot coals, put your feet on it, and wrap your legs with a blanket, and it would help to keep you warm.
Wouldn't the fireplace keep you warm too?
Yes, they would, but fires would not have been burned overnight. The threat of a house fire was just too great. Do you know what the word curfew means?
Well, in my house, it was the latest hour at which you could come home without being grounded for 2 weeks.
That's right. It means you have to be in by a certain time, but it really comes from two Old English words, cur and few, to cover the fire. And church bells in medieval towns in Europe would ring curfew at dusk, and that meant that all the fires in town had to be out. The threat of one fireplace setting an entire town on fire was just too great for the pittance of heat that you would receive from a fireplace overnight. Why don't we go into the next room and I'll show you something else that was used to stay warm. This is a real Franklin stove, a Rittenhouse stove actually. The brothers Rittenhouse swiped the idea from Ben Franklin. But these fireplace liners were a big improvement over a smoky fireplace, and they stayed heated up like a radiator so that they would continue to heat for a while after curfew.
Bruce, I've noticed throughout the house that there are no carpets or rugs. Is that common for this era?
There's really a two-part answer to that question, and the first is that carpets are overdone in restorations as we see them, particularly the Oriental carpets. The second thing is that in our research on this building, we've found everything from underwear to bedclothes, but we've found no carpets for the floors and no curtains at the windows.
It's interesting. Thanks a lot, Bruce.
So who takes care of the property and how do you pay for it?
The Township of Lower Merion owns the property, but the house is operated and maintained by a group called the Harriton Association, which is a not-for-profit membership corporation. We raise money from the public through membership contributions in the association. We also have public events which help to publicize the property and raise money as well. Our plantation fair is held on the last Saturday in September every year, and in the past we've reenacted the Battle of Old Gulf Road, which was fought across this property in December of 1777. The idea is to continue the preservation of this site by making people aware of its important history. And we have an important partnership with Lower Merion Township to help accomplish this.
We invite you to visit and learn from the Harritons something of our local and national heritage, and we urge you to help support the continued preservation of our historical landmarks.